At dawn, the White House issued a stark ultimatum. Canada was given just 72 hours to accept a set of demands or face severe tariffs that could paralyze key sectors. Time was running out fast. Every hour carried weight. The issues at stake included employment, energy supplies, food security, and the fundamental trade equilibrium between two of the planet's tightest allies. The reply didn't come from an elected official. It came from Mark Carney, a figure respected for his composed and tactical thinking. In a matter of minutes, he provided a response that caught Washington off guard and sent shockwaves through financial markets and government centers worldwide. The events that followed threatened to redefine U.S.-Canada trade relations for a long time to come. On the surface, the White House document appeared to be a routine trade discussion paper. Courteous wording, balanced expressions, formal layout. It presented itself as a structure for updated commercial ties between the United States and Canada. Yet behind the diplomatic phrasing lay an exceptionally aggressive set of requirements. 4 major conditions were specified, each one requiring Canada to relinquish significant authority over its legislation, energy sector, and natural assets even before official negotiations could start. This was not an opening position. It was a non-negotiable boundary, a deliberate challenge. The first condition called for the complete and immediate elimination of every Canadian retaliatory tariff. No gradual reduction, no staged withdrawal. All protective measures shielding Canadian industries had to disappear before dialogue could even begin. The second condition targeted Canada's fundamental control over its natural resources: crude oil, natural gas, and electricity. Ottawa was expected to lock in fixed pricing arrangements with the United States, effectively placing a sovereign country's energy system under external supervision, something no Canadian government could accept. The third demand involved making tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum exports permanent. Temporary restrictions might be negotiable. Permanent ones would embed long-lasting trade obstacles capable of reshaping commerce for generations. The fourth requirement concerned agriculture and food safety rules. The United States insisted Canada instantly harmonize every regulation with American standards. No phased alignment, no bargaining, no debate, simply immediate and total adoption. Collectively, these 4 points went far beyond minor adjustments. They represented deep structural changes intended to compel Canada to yield under intense time pressure. Inside the White House, confidence ran high. Senior figures believed the overwhelming size and magnetic force of the U.S. economy would leave Canada little choice but to comply. Top aides spoke candidly about establishing a new standard. Swift action and heavy pressure would outweigh careful deliberation. The public line was straightforward: decide quickly or pay a steep price. Washington presented the move as a modern, equitable step benefiting American workers. The language appeared collaborative. The intent was unmistakable: rapid dominance and maximum pressure. Canada's answer, however, avoided political drama. It relied on precise, disciplined strategy. During a crowded press briefing, the response came from one individual, Mark Carney. His delivery was steady, controlled, and purposeful. He spoke briefly. Every phrase was carefully chosen, every silence deliberate. He made it clear that Canada would not hand over authority over its laws or resources prior to negotiations. He stated plainly that Ottawa would never agree to energy pricing dictated by another country. Then he left the podium without fielding questions or elaborating further. The entire statement lasted 3 minutes. Financial markets responded within seconds. Traders read Carney's words as an unequivocal rejection, and the effects appeared immediately. Energy companies prepared for possible turbulence. Automakers and industrial firms revised their risk assessments. Agricultural prices shifted as experts anticipated supply interruptions. The signal was unmistakable. Canada was not backing down, not at this moment, not under these terms. Washington registered genuine surprise. Reactions within political circles varied. President Trump described the refusal as a serious error. Senior officials called Canada ungrateful. Still, even among Republicans, discomfort began to surface. Senators representing states reliant on energy, steel, and farming started raising concerns. They recognized the domestic implications: higher pump prices, elevated grocery costs, and possible employment disruptions. The political equation in Washington had shifted from projecting strength to containing fallout for millions of American households. The effectiveness of Carney's method rested in its restraint. By delivering a concise, composed public rejection, he changed the negotiation landscape before formal talks even started. The 72-hour deadline abruptly became a liability for Washington rather than Ottawa. The political price of pressing Canada too aggressively materialized right away. The larger insight was clear. Protecting sovereignty, applying measured economic pressure, and choosing the right moment can alter power dynamics more quickly than lengthy speeches, social media blasts, or dramatic deadlines. What unfolded next would influence not only the resolution of this trade conflict, but also the pattern for how the United States engages its closest partners in future high-pressure discussions. Canada's position went beyond resisting one set of tariffs. It showed that disciplined strategy, patience, and a solid grasp of economic realities can effectively counter even the boldest coercive tactics. In the hours ahead, financial markets, elected officials, and everyday households would all experience the consequences. The morning following Canada's rapid response, the White House entered crisis mode. Staff rushed to evaluate the damage caused by Carney's brief statement. Internally, the atmosphere grew strained. The 72-hour deadline, meant to secure instant agreement, had instead exposed a major strategic error. Canada refused to yield. Lawmakers from energy-producing, farming, and industrial regions began contacting senior staff, pressing for clarity on the domestic political risks of imposing broad tariffs on a vital ally. The math was harsh. Increased fuel costs, climbing food prices, and possible slowdowns in integrated manufacturing could affect millions of Americans within weeks rather than months. President Trump quickly turned to social media. His messages framed Canada's stance as a direct challenge to American determination. Posts declared that so-called experts mistakenly believe they can intimidate the United States and promised to demonstrate who held the stronger hand. "America doesn't negotiate from weakness. America first," he stated. The tone was typical, blunt, combative, aimed at energizing supporters while projecting continued dominance. Yet privately, senior advisors were quietly examining the wider fallout. A drawn-out dispute risked serious domestic opposition. Even traditionally loyal Republican lawmakers started voicing reservations about impacts on farming regions, energy corridors, and the automotive sector. Financial markets displayed sharp volatility almost instantly. Energy shares fluctuated as traders reassessed tariff risks on oil and gas. Crude and natural gas futures climbed amid supply disruption fears. Steel and aluminum costs began rising, foreshadowing higher expenses for U.S. manufacturers. Companies in the auto and parts industries, whose assembly lines depend on components crossing the border repeatedly, started updating delivery schedules and earnings projections. Minor interruptions in trucking and rail, the backbone of integrated trade, were sufficient to trigger widespread ripple effects. Investors now had to weigh whether this represented a brief standoff or the beginning of an extended trade war. Across the political landscape, analysts examined what Carney's rejection truly signified. Certain Republican senators, typically supportive of the administration, openly admitted that excessive pressure on Canada might produce the opposite result. Governors in major agricultural states expressed worry about increased costs for fertilizer and crops. Democratic figures stressed that repeated trade threats perceived as empty could undermine U.S. credibility abroad. Every comment, every appearance, every news cycle became another piece on the strategic board. Public discussion echoed the private risk assessments taking place inside Washington offices. Carney's approach, however, contained deeper elements than a simple denial. By rejecting preconditions in full public view, Canada ensured that any subsequent softening of the U.S. position would carry immediate political damage. If the administration eased its terms, Trump risked accusations from his core supporters of weakness in trade battles. If he intensified the pressure, the costs would strike American consumers and businesses directly and quickly. Visible increases in gasoline, groceries, and supply chain delays, every choice now came with clear, immediate consequences. In Canada, businesses and markets observed developments with a blend of vigilance and reassurance. Farmers, energy producers, and manufacturers understood the deadline pressure, but welcomed the clarity provided by Ottawa's stance. No acceptance of preconditions meant talks could proceed without Canada surrendering control over its laws or economic decisions. That certainty, even amid uncertainty, enabled firms to develop develop backup plans, reach out to alternative customers, and simulate tariff scenarios. Economists observed that Carney's restrained style avoided market panic while reminding Washington that Canada possessed real leverage. Quiet diplomatic communications began moving behind the scenes. Canadian representatives discreetly contacted counterparts in Europe and Asia to discuss risk mitigation options should the situation worsen. Carney's composed public remarks served two functions simultaneously. They safeguarded Canada's negotiating posture and conveyed to global partners and investors that Ottawa was ready, deliberate, and firmly in command. Washington's entire strategy had rested on the belief that Canada's economic reliance on the U.S. market would force swift capitulation. Carney's response demolished that premise. By holding firm, Canada revealed the boundaries of American influence. The episode was never merely a tariff disagreement. It became a revealing case study in how political communication, market reactions, and deep economic ties collide. With each passing hour, each price movement, and each official remark, the strain intensified. People in both nations started sensing the seriousness without yet fully understanding the scope. Gas stations watching supply, grocery chains tracking commodity costs, factories adjusting production estimates. Beneath every headline about a trade clash existed a dense network of choices directly affecting ordinary lives. Carney's quiet resolve had transformed what was intended as a rapid ultimatum into a complex, suspense-filled strategic contest, one in which timing, endurance, and careful planning proved more powerful than sheer economic weight. The central lesson emerged clearly. This was no longer solely a tariff battle. It had become a contest over influence, credibility, and political maneuvering. Canada had successfully shifted the storyline. The 72-hour timer now pressed Washington just as heavily as Ottawa. Every social media post, every briefing, every market adjustment fed into the evolving narrative. Analysts started outlining three plausible trajectories: swift mutual concessions, extended confrontation, or a slow but lasting reorganization of North American trade flows that could reshape the regional economy for decades. Each outcome carried implications stretching well beyond the immediate days, touching millions of livelihoods and influencing global views of American strength. As the deadline continued counting down, the concrete effects of the standoff became impossible to overlook. Financial markets reacted sharply to Carney's firm statement. Energy futures rose quickly, with crude oil and natural gas prices climbing as traders priced in possible supply interruptions. The automotive industry recalibrated projections, aware that individual vehicles incorporate parts crossing the border several times during assembly. Even slight holdups in steel or aluminum shipments could generate widespread cost increases across factories. Production schedules, supplier contracts, and logistics arrangements suddenly carried an unfamiliar layer of risk. Investors and economists soon recognized that the dispute went far beyond ordinary trade friction. This was a fundamental clash over sovereignty, pricing authority, and long-term economic direction. Canadian companies began modeling severe scenarios. What if energy exports encountered quotas or mandated prices? What if steel and aluminum tariffs solidified into enduring barriers? Farmers faced equally serious threats. Exports of grains, dairy, and meat to the U.S. form critical income sources, and abrupt policy changes could inflict heavy financial damage. The uncertainty itself was sufficient to unsettle commodity exchanges and equity markets. In Ottawa, the approach remained disciplined and forward-looking. Carney and his advisors were not simply responding, they were anticipating. Every public word, every deliberate pause, every carefully timed silence was designed to strengthen Canada's position. By rejecting preconditions outright, Canada compelled the United States to act publicly rather than through back-channel pressure. Every tweet, every official release, every internal discussion now carried instant political weight. Carney had converted a tight deadline into a sustained strategic benefit. Inside the White House, internal disagreements grew sharper. Advisors divided between those advocating intensified pressure to compel agreement and those urging a reassessment of the costs of continued deadlock. Republican lawmakers from agriculture-heavy and energy-dependent states expressed increasing alarm. Sharp rises in gasoline or heating expenses, combined with climbing food prices, could generate fast and powerful voter backlash. Democrats quickly capitalized, portraying the ultimatum as impulsive and harmful to ordinary American families. Early polling data began showing rising public concern, further complicating the administration's political math. Economists throughout the continent started simulating potential results. Should Canada hold its ground and tariffs take effect, short-term U.S. GDP could decline, with the heaviest impact falling on manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. Canada's economy, by contrast, appeared more resilient, as Ottawa could redirect trade toward Europe and Asia. The asymmetry in trade dependence, the tight integration of supply chains, and Canada's contingency planning revealed that Washington's presumed dominance was far from absolute. The notion that a larger economy automatically dictates terms was proving seriously mistaken. Across corporate boardrooms, contingency measures activated rapidly. Automakers adjusted production timelines and sought backup suppliers for border-dependent components. Energy firms reviewed storage capacity, pipeline flows, and alternative export routes to cushion potential tariff effects. Farmers and food processors started hedging positions and reconfiguring distribution networks in preparation for disrupted traditional channels. Even smaller enterprises, especially those reliant on cross-border shipments or imported inputs, felt the strain and began revising forecasts. Beyond the statistics, the confrontation carried significant psychological impact. Carney's composed resistance sent a message not only to Washington but to other international observers. Partners in Europe and Asia noted that Canada could maintain its position under extreme pressure. The takeaway was straightforward: preconditions would not control the negotiation process. That shift altered perceptions of Canadian determination and, by extension, the reliability of North American trade relationships. Carney had defended Canada's sovereignty while quietly redirecting the broader strategic discussion toward Ottawa's advantage, converting an intended quick surrender into a multifaceted negotiation environment. Diplomatically, Canada initiated discreet coordination with other countries. The core message was direct: contingency arrangements existed, and if required, partners would assist in diversifying trade pathways. This was not mere posturing, it was practical preparation. European and Asian contacts received briefings on possible spillover effects. Supply chain alternatives were examined, and financial exposures were reviewed. Markets reacted in real time to any indication of wider coordination, with investors increasingly conscious that the implications reached well beyond North America. At its core, the confrontation exposed a basic misjudgment in Washington. Economic scale alone does not guarantee complete control. Canada's strategic posture, paired with Carney's precise timing and clear communication, turned an intended swift capitulation into an extended examination of political, economic, and societal endurance. By the close of the first full day, it was obvious this was no standard trade disagreement. It had become a contest over influence, reputation, and the actual workings of international bargaining. Even ordinary citizens started noticing faint but real changes. Gasoline prices edged upward. Grocery costs began to adjust. Manufacturers circulated internal notices about rising expense projections. Workers in energy, agriculture, and industrial sectors grew more uneasy about stability. For many, the trade dispute had ceased being theoretical. It was beginning to affect wallets, employment, and routines in concrete ways. Carney's brief statement had generated an immediate, powerful ripple effect. By the middle of the 72-hour period, the atmosphere had grown markedly more intense. Global attention was fixed, markets continued moving, and Washington confronted rising internal political strain. Every choice, every remark, every analysis now carried genuine significance. Carney had effectively rewritten the story. The issue was no longer about haste or intimidation. It had become a test of strategic depth, bargaining power, and the capacity to endure pressure while preserving control over domestic laws and economic systems. As the deadline drew closer, pressure in both capitals reached extraordinary levels. Behind closed doors, teams in Washington and Ottawa raced through data, prepared fallback options, and modeled outcomes at high speed. Every discussion and document mattered deeply. The decisions were no longer abstract. They held the potential to impact millions of households and companies on both sides of the border within days. In Washington, the administration confronted a difficult fork: intensify or pull back. Internal arguments grew heated. Some voices pushed for immediate tariff imposition to demonstrate authority, insisting that economic size should dictate terms and smaller neighbors cannot set conditions for larger ones. Yet concern about unintended fallout spread even inside the White House. Republican senators from farm states cautioned that steep tariffs could strike their voters directly, risking serious electoral consequences. Energy industry leaders pressed their case, warning that any interruption in oil and gas movements could drive nationwide fuel prices sharply higher. Trump, who prized bold decisions, now faced an unfamiliar kind of constraint. Carney's swift, composed reply had reframed the entire episode. The 72-hour clock, originally meant to showcase decisiveness, now worked against the administration. Softening the demands risked appearing weak to his supporters. Escalating would bring swift, visible hardship to American families: higher fuel costs, increased heating bills, rising grocery prices. Every passing hour magnified the pressure. Ottawa, meanwhile, held its consistent course. Carney's short, deliberate statement had achieved far more than rejecting preconditions. It provided political protection for Canadian leadership. By taking a firm public stand, Ottawa compelled Washington to act under intense observation from markets, legislators, and the press. The Canadian position had also reassured allies in Europe and Asia that Canada possessed the resilience to resist coercion. Quiet activation of trade contingency arrangements with other regions began, readying for any necessary reduction in dependence on the U.S. market. The effects appeared promptly. Energy markets fluctuated as traders evaluated possible impacts on oil and gas movements. Auto production recalculated expenses, incorporating potential border delays. Steel and aluminum prices reflected uncertainty, pointing to higher costs for construction, manufacturing, and equipment sectors. Farmers studied futures for grain, dairy, and meat, aware that sudden changes could slash income almost immediately. Across the continent, businesses and individuals sensed the quiet tremors of this major confrontation. Political pressure inside the United States intensified further. Democratic figures used the moment to criticize the administration's tactics, describing the ultimatum as irresponsible and likely to harm American families. Republican senators voiced worries about collateral damage, focusing on political dangers in agriculture-dependent, energy-producing, and manufacturing-heavy states. News coverage heightened the drama, portraying a determined Canada facing an assertive Washington. Each public statement added to the strain, and the broader public started comprehending the seriousness. This was not a conventional trade discussion. It had developed into a strategic contest with direct, measurable consequences. Carney's method had turned the process into one of deliberate timing. By rejecting preconditions openly, Canada ensured that every American move would carry visible political weight. Moderation risked domestic criticism. Escalation promised immediate economic pain for U.S. citizens. At the same time, Carney's calm, disciplined presence kept Canada steady, assuring domestic audiences that Ottawa held leverage, determination, and strategic patience. That mental advantage proved as important as any tariff or regulation. Markets and economists began forecasting possible futures. In one scenario, Washington eases back, dropping the harshest conditions to limit domestic damage, allowing talks to begin with reduced preconditions. Markets stabilize, political risks decline, and both sides can claim partial success. In another, neither side gives ground. Tariffs take effect. Integrated supply chains experience immediate stress. Fuel and food prices rise. Production slows, and political friction increases sharply. A third possibility sees Canada's public resolve encourage other countries to gradually reduce dependence on the U.S. market, slowly reshaping continental trade patterns over months or years and altering perceptions of economic power in North America. The human dimension was unmistakable. Households noticed small shifts first: slightly higher fuel costs, modestly increased grocery bills, occasional delays on imported items. Workers in energy, farming, and manufacturing began worrying about schedules, output targets, and job stability. Small firms with thin margins started revising plans, finding substitute suppliers, and bracing for logistics problems. Even modest supply chain interruptions produced immediate downstream consequences that reached everyday life in communities throughout the region. Legal considerations also surfaced. Trade attorneys and policy experts in both nations assessed potential cases before the WTO and other forums. Ottawa's refusal to accept preconditions meant unilateral U.S. tariffs could spark formal international disputes, likely to drag on for months or years. Carney's approach created valuable breathing room. Canada could defend its sovereignty while making clear that escalation would carry legal, political, and diplomatic costs beyond pure economics. Meanwhile, energy and agricultural executives quietly evaluated longer-term risks. Pipelines, refineries, processing plants, and terminals involve planning horizons measured in decades. A single tariff-related disruption could postpone major investments, reduce hiring, and affect entire communities built around these sectors. Farmers and processors modeled price volatility and investigated alternative markets, preparing for situations where U.S. demand might contract temporarily or permanently. Carney's brief reply had set off extensive strategic planning across numerous industries. The political landscape in Washington remained fluid. Lawmakers carefully judged the appearance of each decision. Moderation might calm markets but invite charges of weakness. Escalation risked public anger and economic hardship in politically sensitive regions. In Ottawa, leaders worked to preserve resolute positions without provoking unnecessary escalation, maintaining market stability and public confidence. The delicate equilibrium among domestic politics, global credibility, and economic steadiness shaped every step. Carney's 3-minute statement had achieved far more than deflecting a tight deadline. It had fundamentally altered the terms of the contest. The dispute was no longer simply about trade conditions. It had become a struggle over strategic positioning, political messaging, and the practical conduct of economic diplomacy. Ordinary citizens, from drivers filling tanks to factory employees building vehicles, suddenly found themselves living inside the real-time consequences of a high-stakes public strategy. By the close of the second day, it was evident this confrontation would be remembered not merely for tariffs or ultimatums, but for the exact calculated manner in which one carefully delivered public response could transform the entire playing field. For years to come, every market movement, every political remark, every legal assessment would form part of this larger story. Carney had made Canada's determination unmistakable, and Washington's presumed dominance was no longer assured. The true contest had only just started, and its consequences would touch millions across the coming days, weeks, and months.